Okay. My name is Jeremy Hopewell, and I've always had an interest in genetics. And my interest came from two things. The first thing was the movie Jurassic Park. I love that movie. When I first saw it, I thought, okay, it's possible. I can take two animals and recreate like some old animal that that didn't exist now. Like now they took the mosquito from the sap, and then they mixed it with lizards, and they created dinosaurs. So I was like, oh man, with genetics, anything is possible. And then I also have a desire to always know why. Like, why is this like this, or why is that like that? And I would just like to ask, did you ever notice that some people will always say, oh, you have your mother's eyes, or oh, you have your father's nose? And these are just examples of everyday genetics that people happen to notice. For example, my hairline is a widow's peak, and I also have a specific widow's peak hairline, which is, it looks like I have two little horns. So if there's any other widow-related genetic traits, I probably have that too, because I have these other widow's peak, other widow-related traits. And the widow's peak itself is a recessive trait, and this is according to the World Book Encyclopedia. And the actual widow's peak is a dominant trait. So let me rephrase that. The widow's peak itself is a dominant trait. The hairline is a recessive trait. So today I hope to not only give a brief introduction to genetics, but to also highlight three very unique traits and how they are derived that never occurred to me as being specifically genetic. So before I begin, you may be wondering, how does this relate to me? Like, what am I ever going to do with the knowledge of genetics? And I would just like to say, like, this is a great conversation piece, such as, hey, did you ever know that? Like, trust me on it. I've had experiences where I've brought this up to people and they just go like, oh, wow, I didn't know that. And they start checking out too, and then they try and find that people in their family are the same way too. So first, I would just like to give a brief insight on what genetics entail. And genetics is a discipline of biology that relates to the science of heredity, genes, and the variation in living organisms. That's not just people, it's also plants, animals. And genetics is used in a variety of different ways, such as discovering medical disorders or simply predicting a person's eye color, like I mentioned above. Or not above, in the previous, in my introduction. Along the lines of discovering traits, genetic details explain where the traits come from and also how they're inherited. There's different ways traits are inherited, and really if I went into in-depth, I think my speech would become like a 50-minute speech, because genetics is always changing. It's very in-depth, and just recently, a professor named John H. McDonald, he has a PhD at the University of Delaware, and he wrote an article on the myths of human genetics, just recently discussed how, can you believe this was considered a genetic trait? Which arm was the dominant arm when you made a motion like this? Or, when people go like this, if they put their right thumb over their left thumb, or their left thumb over their right thumb, or they just go like this and have both their thumbs like that. That was considered a genetic trait. So first, in the vein of hand clasping, I would like to talk about three often neglected genetic traits, and also see if anybody in the classroom displays these traits as well. The first trait I would like to go over is tongue rolling, like this. Can anybody else do that? Got a couple people. And what tongue rolling is an example of a dominant recessive trait, but there's also a twist. Let me ask, does anybody know what dominant and recessive traits are before I explain them? Okay, well I can't tell if everybody's shaking their head, so I'll just go and explain anyway. Dominant or recessive means if a trait is dominant, it will be the trait that is displayed, and if a trait is recessive, the only way you'll present that trait is if you have two recessive traits. And the way you get the traits is from your parents. In certain instances, they only have two genes, well, two alleles, that's what it's specifically called, that they're going to pass on to their children. And if two parents get together and they both pass on the recessive alleles, then the recessive trait is going to be displayed. And if one parent passes on the dominant one, while the other one passes on the recessive, the dominant trait is going to be displayed. So a tongue rolling is an example of, surprisingly, it is a dominant gene. And the twist is that there's lots of studies with twins, which is studied by John H. McDonald, the professor with the PhD that I mentioned. He did a study with twins, and he noticed that the two parents both had the dominant trait for tongue rolling, but when it was passed on to their twins, Only one twin showed the trait for tongue rolling when they were little, but as they got older, the other twins started to be able to roll their tongue as well. So I thought that was pretty interesting that environment has an effect on that. And the next random trait, I'm going to go from the tongue down to the hands, and it's the thumb specifically. The next one is the hitchhiker's thumb. Does anybody know what that is? Yeah, see, he's got the perfect hitchhiker's thumb that goes in a 90-degree angle. I think mine only goes about 75, hey, Chris has it too. Mine goes about 75 degrees, I think. You kind of have it. If you go like this, you can really tell if you definitely have it or not. So, what this came from, it used to be thought that people who hitchhiked, their thumbs started out like this, but the more they did it, their thumb would start to look like that, which is obviously a myth. And the hitchhiker's thumb is a trait that is, it's sort of like, you can't really say specifically it's dominant or recessive. It seems like the basic idea is that what is passed along from your parents is more of the angle at which your thumb can be shown like this. Like mine's more of a 75 degree, it's not perfectly 90, so you can't say that it is specifically a dominant or a recessive trait. So the last and final trait that I would like to talk about is we go from the hands up to the ears. And what I would like to say is, does anybody have an idea where I might be going with this?
Attached earlobes.
Attached, detached, and semi-attached earlobes. I have a detached earlobe, which is a dominant trait. See, like this. Does anybody have an attached earlobe?
I don't think.
I think Dante does. So that would be a recessive trait. And what this shows is an intermediate trait, which is if a parent had a dominant and a recessive gene, it would be semi-detached. And a dominant is what I have, which is detached, and the recessive is the detached. So, so we just skimmed the surface on genetics, and I've also discussed 3 random traits: tongue rolling, hitchhiker's thumb, earlobe detachment. So I'm almost positive you've never heard anybody say, oh, you have your mother's hitchhiker's thumb. But on that note, I just wanted to let you guys know about these specific traits, and they're perfect for hey, did you ever know that sort of conversation?